No worries.
Hi, colleagues. Thank you for joining. For our online participants, we'll wait for a couple of minutes for our participants here to sit down. We'll start the conversation in about 3 minutes. You're already on the side. Sure.
Yeah. No, it's not. It's usually quite soft.
Good morning, colleagues. I think we can get started right now. Thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to this session on humanitarian access in practice, security, civil military coordination, and access working together. My name is Li Wei. I'm the Associate Field Security Officer and Humanitarian Access Lead from UNCR, and I will be moderating today's session. Thank you very much for joining, both in person and online. Now, before we begin, let me briefly set the scene, very briefly, because I'm sure that many of us have experienced and also hear from HNPW sessions probably yesterday about the current humanitarian context. So across many humanitarian contexts today, humanitarian access is becoming increasingly complex. Operational environments are shaped by conflict dynamics, fragmented armed actors, administrative restrictions, and shrinking humanitarian space. So in these environments, ensuring that assistance reaches to people in need and also people in need receive the humanitarian assistance, those requires more than one function working alone. Humanitarian access, security risk management, civil military coordination, and diplomatic engagement are all critical enablers of principled humanitarian access. Each of these functions has its own expertise and mandate, but in practice, they operate together to enable safe, sustained, and principled access to affected populations. Today, we are fortunate to have a panel bring together perspectives from across these different functions. Let me briefly introduce our panelists. I think starting from the online panelists, we have Paul Farrell, Principal Security Coordinator at UNICEF. Thank you again for joining at early New York hours. We have Savita Hande, Principal Security Advisor in DRC with UNDSS. We have Jochen Rig, Global Lead for Humanitarian Access at Norwegian Refugee Council. And we have Philippe Riding, Deputy Director for Global Analysis at international NGO safety organization. And sitting next to me, we have Colin Corrigan, Head of Diplomatic Engagement, Humanitarian Diplomacy Service at the World Food Programme. And we have Omar Ahmed Abenzat, Director of Global and Field Programs at Civic. Thank you very much for joining the discussion. Now, our goal today is to explore how these functions intersect in practice. And this session will last for 90 minutes. We will start with around 40 minutes panel discussion, followed by 40 minutes Q&A, and then a final reflection from the panelists. For our online participants, I would encourage you to use the Q&A function to post your questions along the way of our conversation. And for our guests in the room, we will also have time for you to raise your question directly afterwards. So now let's get started. To begin, I think it's very useful to kind of step back and look at the broader global picture. Many organizations are now tracking access constraints systematically. And these data sets provide valuable insights into how operating environments are evolving. So my first question is really about what the evidence is telling us. So I would like to first turn to Jochen from NRC, and then we'll hear from Phil from INSO. A question for you. What are the data and trends telling us regarding the nature of access constraints, their severity, and the challenges most often faced in humanitarian operations today? Jochen, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me today. So maybe just very briefly, so NRC has been running access severity assessments internally for the last 4 years. And so I think we have a bit of an ability to look back at the last 4 years to understand trends. So I think, but overall, in order to frame like the operational environment, I think we need to like acknowledge the fact that we're working increasingly in an environment where international humanitarian law is being selectively applied or disregarded, which has like huge implications on the access severity assessments and the access severity outcomes in the access environment across the board. In general, if we break down the access severity we've been looking at over the last 4 years, and we've done that in line with like 3 main categories, which is bureaucratic and administrative impediments, conflict-related impediments, and logistical and environmental impediments. Just to say that all of these categories are divided up into like indicators and sub-indicators, which are essentially based on like OCHA's global access monitoring and reporting framework. We have included like the dual dimension of access to also ensure that we at least have some understanding of like people's ability to reach our services. And I think if I need to break it down, what we've seen over the last 4 years, and I don't think it's surprising to anybody, is that bureaucratic and administrative impediments have been the most frequent impediment to humanitarian operations across the board, to NRC operations across the board, closely followed by conflict. We have seen conflict related impediments increase over the last couple of years, mainly due to conflicts in Gaza and then in Sudan. I have to say that we see like the biggest impact, operational impacts on our operations are conflict related and not BAI related. But essentially, what we have done in order to better understand and plan and use the data sets we have is like to overlay needs severity over the access severity mapping we've done. And I think that's especially important looking at like the current conversation about hyper prioritization and operating increasingly in severity 4 and 5 areas. And I think what we see there, if we do that, is that there's a very close correlation between access severity and need severity. So what does it mean for us as a humanitarian community? What does it mean for us as NRC is that while the access capacity is shrinking due to like the cuts we have all witnessed, support functions and common services are being reduced. And as I mentioned, the legal frameworks which are protecting our work and our workers are disregarded or selectively applied, there is more and more of a push to operate like in higher need severity areas. And as I just mentioned, when you overlay needs and access severity, you see that most of these higher need severity areas are also higher in access severity. And so that brings us back to the access severity mapping. And if you look at how we need to address or what are the core issues of some of these bureaucratic and administrative impediments, they're often political, and most of the impediments we see are essentially coming from government. So I think we need to move away, and I think we slowly have moved away, but we need to further move away from the understanding that the access negotiation is your checkpoint negotiation. That's essentially the outcome of like a long political process, which we need to address. And this is, I think, where this panel today is very useful to bring together the different pieces in a more integrated, holistic approach to address these more and more complex humanitarian environments, and to acknowledge the political nature of a lot of these impediments, which we're seeing requiring even more functions than what we're having around the table here today. But I think it's a good start. I'll leave it at that and hand back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Phil, the floor is yours.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks very much. I think what I'll quickly go over is some trends that INSO has the privilege to be able to kind of see due to its geographical scope, its 20-odd different country offices, and also the network of NGOs that we work with, which is roughly about 1,300 globally. What they report to us gives us, I think, quite a well-rounded perspective on threats to both security and access globally. Some of these will kind of chime with what Jochen was just talking about, but what I'll try and do is go from kind of a macro level through to a kind of more local level perspective on what we've seen both over the last year and then increasingly in 2026 as well. So firstly, INSO is really framing its thinking this year around the concepts of an acceptance crisis, which has really kicked off last year under the conditions that were brought about by the dismantling of US aid, which is not the sole cause, but it's one of the precipitate triggers of the way that we're thinking of the access crisis and its various manifestations. From what we see of our global data, incidents impacting humanitarians have never been higher, and that's fueled in almost equal part by both government and non-state armed groups and their interactions with NGOs. But what we really see is, again, just to take that macro to micro approach, is that a decline in multilateralism and a kind of corresponding rise in transactional attitudes to aid amongst a whole swathe of actors, both from traditional donors through to, again, like local armed groups or local officials. That's undermining acceptance of humanitarianism writ large, and then also the principles that underpin it. And the kind of the upshot of that is that we see both hostile narratives around humanitarianism at the global level, as well as at the it's kind of wider breakdown in a multilateral approach, and then again the rise in transactional attitudes, is that those hostile narratives at the global level mean that those at the local level, which might be only loosely connected, are nevertheless harder to counter. So a couple of examples from the last year. We saw accusations made in the US Congress of how, USAID was supposedly funding armed groups in Nigeria, and that led almost immediately to several NGOs facing a kind of in-country investigation by Nigerian authorities looking at their finances and how funding was being spent. We see those kind of, again, like global to more national challenges permeating on a more regular basis over the course of the last year. But then we also see, that again, the prevalence of hostile narratives, even amongst, states that were traditionally supportive of humanitarian action, meaning that it's more difficult for very specific national level challenges to be overcome. So in Iraq, for example, there's been a movement or a tendency for the last few years amongst the Iraqi authorities to discredit humanitarian programming, which involves gender and health activities, supposedly on the basis that these are promulgating, so-called Western values and so on. It's very difficult for NGOs to counter these largely baseless allegations if they themselves are being accused of being undertaking politically charged activity by states that were previously funding their activities. And then just to take that one step further to even more kind of local example, in Mozambique this year we're seeing a series of attacks on aid workers where local nationals believe that cholera vaccination campaigns are in fact contributing to the spread of cholera. Now, clearly, again, there's little merit to those rumors, but in an environment where humanitarians are subject to a degree of mistrust from the global to the national to the local level, it makes it much harder for individual organizations to kind of engage and message local communities accordingly to mitigate the threat to staff and then overcome those hostile narratives. Then just probably another theme that kind of fits within the broader acceptance crisis, we kind of see a tendency for non-state armed groups to increasingly act like states, particularly where they want to claim to be de facto authorities. And I think, again, Jürgen touched on this already, where we see the emergence of kind of parallel access regimes by groups like the RSF in Sudan or M23 in the DRC, where in their efforts to present themselves as legitimate actors, they impose new kind of registration, payment, taxation systems, or they would seek to influence recruitment. And that adds another layer of kind of bureaucratic access impediments on top of those that were already in place as a result of the official state authorities being somewhat skeptical or increasingly skeptical of humanitarian actors and their influence. And then finally, those states themselves, if we think about West Africa and the Sahel, they where we see a number of militarized governments that have emerged after coups over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. Those states are now increasingly acting arbitrarily and without any real due process or accountability, increasingly like we might expect non-state armed groups to act. So NGO staff are increasingly detained, and those detentions by state actors can often look quite like kidnappings by OAGs, in that we're not entirely certain where staff have been detained, who has detained them, the justification, and so on and so forth. And these can become protracted negotiations for those staff to be released in a manner that we might otherwise have expected to come from armed groups rather than official actors. So I hope that gives you a sense of some of the kind of access and safety challenges, the way that they're interacting, the way that they've been communicated to INSO by our partners. But otherwise, I'll hand back to you, Liwei, and let the conversation move on. But happy to pick up any of those threads in the questions and answers later.
Thank you. Thank you, Jürgen and Theo, and thank you for sharing those insights. I think what we can hear clearly is that access challenges are becoming more complex and increasingly more political, with multiple actors influencing humanitarian space. So I think this naturally raises the question of how different operational functions respond to these challenges together. So my next question: security, civil-military coordination, and humanitarian access are separate functions, but in practice, they intersect operationally. I want to invite my colleague Colin, Phil, and Omar to address the question. So how do you understand that intersection, and where does it most often break down? Colin, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay. I think it's important to note two things before I dive into my notes. The first one is that when we're referring to access here, we're talking about technical access teams, not necessarily the concept of humanitarian access as a thing. I think all of these teams support our ability to gain and retain humanitarian access. The second thing I think that's important is that we have to acknowledge that they are distinct functions. I do think they intersect operationally literally every time we try to deliver assistance. So I think that in practice, they all converge around one sort of objective, enabling principled humanitarian access in constrained and politically sensitive environments is what we're seeing today. Maybe more specifically, and I won't dive into it too much because I'm not a security expert, but security manages our exposure to risk. Access and CivMil coordinate operationally, externally, to address access constraints in the operating environment. So the distinction often, I would say, lies in the audience. So the intent of those teams and what they're trying to accomplish. In some contexts, influence requires a deeper understanding of structured military actors, how they function. In others, it may require credibility with a non-state armed group, a de facto authority, or even local power brokers. But I think critically, it's not so much the label of these functions, but rather whether we have the right expertise, the right profiles, engaging the right actors to shift operational barriers in real time. I think that's really becoming the challenge. I do think that when it works well in concert, we bring a level of technical depth that is a comparative advantage. And when decisions are informed by all of these technical teams with complementary perspectives, the operational space tends to expand. I think the more important question is not sort of how these functions have worked in the past or even how they're operating today. It's really how we're going to manage pressures going forward. Are we, I hate this term, but it's useful now. Are we fit for purpose for 2030? And I'm not sure we are. The operating environment's becoming more fragmented, politically layered. That demands deeper specialization, not more generalists, and sustained external influence as well. I think that as a community, if our capacity continues to tighten, while the complexity of these environments continues to increase, we're not simply weaker. It's not simply weaker internal alignment. The risk is our reduced ability to influence the external environment and move the needle on access where it matters most on the ground. So I think what we're seeing is a dangerous trend in a variety of ways. The reduction in staff across the board on all the organizations has resulted in less technical capacity to manage these problems, where these problems and these risks are growing exponentially by the day. And we need to find a solution. So with that, I'll hand it back to Leroy. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Now, over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Leroy. Yeah. So again, I think I'll try and talk a little bit on the interaction of safety and access, and then slightly access and SIM-Coord as a somewhat separate issue. Again, through the perspective of the reporting that comes to us from our network of partners. So as I think probably many of you are aware, INSO collects data on both security and access, but it's pretty clear from our partners' perspective that there's not really a clear distinction between what would constitute a security incident and what would constitute an access incident, with a couple of exceptions. But it really depends on an individual NGO's risk tolerance as to whether a particular concentration of security incidents, for example, therefore necessarily constitutes an impediment to access. And I think probably a useful kind of logical next step is that rather than seeing this as a complex issue that we need to unpick the precise relationship between security incidents and access incidents, NGOs should just be comfortable with the subjectivity of both security and access, given that no two organizations have the same degree of risk tolerance, because they necessarily, that risk tolerance is necessarily based on their specific profile, the criticality of their programming, their communication and acceptance amongst local actors, and then obviously their individual capacity to manage risk and exploit access opportunities that might be there as a result of either historic relations to local actors or particular characteristics of the organizational programming that mean that they enjoy opportunities that others might not. So yeah, accepting the subjectivity of safety and access, I think, is important, and just being content within a system whereby we do not all, as members of the NGO community, need to have the same degree of access. We need to reinforce success where certain organizations may be best placed to realize it. On access and SIM-Coord, I think SIM-Coord interacts or intersects with both security and access to the extent that I think historically NGOs have really approached SIM-Coord or any interaction with military actors as a fairly transactional one, whereby we hand over details of our locations and our staff or our movements, and we expect protection and unhindered movement accordingly. The problem with that approach is that it fails to treat military actors with the same degree of kind of sophistication and nuance that we would expect our engagement with, say, local community leaders or indeed government officials to reflect. So the position that INSO is really taking is to try and persuade partners to see that they should aim for a dialogue with militaries rather than relying on simple transactions. best way to ensure that Coord as a function improves both program resilience and then also promotes sort of safety and access within institutional cultures, whether it be at the local level or the global level. So yeah, again, our approach is to really try and encourage NGOs to look at trying to build relationships with militaries in the same way that they would expect to do them with other government actors or community leaders, and try and generate that mutual understanding of their respective mandates, principles, frameworks, and priorities. And clearly that is not an easy process, and one which is complicated by some of the trends that I spoke about earlier, namely that kind of increasing mistrust of humanitarian actors writ large, the principles that underpin humanitarian action, increasingly approach that we see in global political discourse. So I'm not seeking to kind of underplay or downplay the challenges of making that transition from transaction to dialogue, but just acknowledge that this is an important step for us to take as members of the humanitarian community. Sorry, back to you, Liwei.
Thank you, Phil. Now let's hear from Omar.
Thanks. First of all, thanks to UNHCR for organizing this timely and relevant discussion and for inviting Civic. I think the answer is quite obvious, and we all agree that those three sectors of the system do intersect with each other and do influence each other, right? In security discussions, there's very often access and relevance of CivMil. In CivMil or in civic discussions, you're going to have very often issues that are addressed to access and protection of civilians, and in access, you're going to have the other sectors popping out often, right? Access mostly due to insecurity as one of the main trends, as it was presented by INSO. Now, in terms of gaps, I will share maybe two main elements where we perceive there are maybe gaps in the, maximizing the convergence of these three different sectors that belong to the same ecosystem and that in the end are looking for the similar objective, right? Which is a more efficient response and enabling capacity for the response to reach the largest amount of population. So one of the gaps would be perhaps the typology of the platforms that exist today in order to coordinate access, CIMIC, and security. And the second one, the nature of the security actors we have to engage with in a humanitarian crisis. No? Typology-wise, I think everybody will agree if I say that when you go to those different discussions, especially on CIMIC coordination discussions, being CIMIC as part of the usually led UN system or as more organic discussions in between security actors and NGOs, if multilaterally, because they can also happen multilaterally. One asks himself if you have the people sitting on the table who should be listening to those issues and who will be the ones capable of addressing those issues, right? Very often, I look at the humanitarian system and the security sector system as a pyramid, and then the top of the iceberg or the top of that pyramid, which is 1, 2, 3, 4 people are talking to each other, but then you have 50,000 combatants or 20,000 combatants of armies or security actors who are not listening to those discussions. And then that person who is representing the security actor in the coordination meetings does not always have the capacity, the interest, the power, the time, the energy, the resources to share and to cascade down all of the information that has been shared with the humanitarians, right? Maybe on the humanitarian side of things, we invest a little bit more on having people talking to the security actors, but are there enough INGOs or enough UN agencies talking to them? Are they all talking to the same people? Are they multiplying the amount of people they could be talking to? Are they too centralized, talking to them in capitals and not always necessarily in the field and in different geographic areas? So those are questions that are relevant, in my opinion, when it comes to the composition of those platforms where we are addressing issues related to access, protection, and security. Thematic-wise as well, those are very, system-led, is humanitarian concerns, humanitarian actors-led concerns. But I always wonder if we are hearing from the communities themselves what are actually their main concerns when it comes to access to the services, right? There are systems, certainly subclusters or organic discussions that NGOs are having in the field with communities, but one feels that there could be more of a civilian-led filling of the agenda of those discussions, and I wonder to what extent we could have more local actors or communities represented in those discussions, so that we can also have the picture of what it is that they really need. No, as civic, we do a lot of civil military dialogue, but it's is a bilateral dialogue in between communities and the military actors we engage, and this is very often led and populated by, led in terms of the agenda and populated in terms of the substance and the presence by the communities, right? And in places like Somalia or Yemen, there's been access negotiated beyond or out of the classical system of coordination, simply because of empowering communities to identify what are the real needs, on what exactly do we focus when they say there's access gaps, and how do we engage, and who do we engage in terms of the military actor, who within the system, and where exactly. No? So this additional granularity and zooming in, I think it's relevant. No? And then on the second gap, on the nature of the security actors, I think that this is perhaps one of the largest. No, and I was explaining in at the very beginning. I do still feel, or we do still see as civic a massive perception issue, where again you have a little amount of people within a security actor, being a non-state armed group, a de facto authority, or security force, police, the army, or a self-defense force. There's a massive lack of knowledge about the humanitarian system, about the humanitarian organizations, and that is clearly affecting on the way you can eventually implement whatever has been decided with the leadership, and on the way especially operations on the ground and in field locations are properly being implemented when it comes to the enabling responsibility of those security actors. So I think a little bit more of investment in there could be made. These again, a clear example, Sudan has been mentioned, but to me a clear example that we continue seeing is Sudan, right? There's a, in my opinion, and as per what we observe, there's still a massive misperception of the humanitarian sector and the humanitarian culture by SAF to start with, and then there's of course a traditional hostility, and there's a history, but today there's still a big gap, or a big wall, I would say, in between an actor like SAF and the humanitarian. So multiplying those interactions, better mapping the actor itself, and then multiplying to who do we have to engage with in SAF. That would certainly be very, very helpful. It would build additional trust. It would increase channels of communication, and it would allow as well for those who try to push for those security actors to develop their own mechanisms as well, to be aware of the relevance of humanitarian access, protection of civilians, to have a better way, a little bit more of a fertile ground to do that, right? As you may know, we try very often to build the mechanisms that have security actors identifying themselves, where are they not doing well, where they could be integrating civilian voices and civilian needs more often in their military operations, what are the mechanisms to follow up the harm that they are perpetrating, so all of that requires awareness bilaterally, but requires as well awareness by the humanitarian sector, perhaps trying to reach out a little bit farther, deeper, and within the security actors. So I'll keep it here and continue afterwards.
Thank you, Omar. Just before I turn to the next panelist, colleagues, please keep the questions coming from online using the Q&A, and also we will endeavor to make sure we have enough time for you in the room also to propose any questions. So I think with all those points, what we hearing now is that those functions may have different technical roles, but they all contribute to enabling humanitarian action. Now I would like to discuss more from the security risk management angle. I would like to invite Paul to share your perspective on how does security risk management play into this broader discussion about humanitarian access. Paul, you have the floor.
Thank you. You can hear me?
Yes, we can. Loud and clear.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm not there. I can't see people in the room, and I definitely can't see the 82 people online. But thank you for having me. Yes, and to discuss a bit more detail on the security part of those three parts discussed just now. So in principle, what we refer to as security risk management or security program or whatever we want to call it, it's meant primarily to enable the organization to achieve its objectives and goals, including access objectives for humanitarian action. So this is the first statement on this, is that security risk management or security actions are not an end in itself or in themselves. So that means that when there's a security type problem that may be causing access constraint, this is where security can help. And when I say a security type problem, let's be very clear on what this means. This is some sort of deliberate harm that may directly or indirectly impact humanitarian actors when they're working in an environment. So getting shot, getting their carjacked, getting kidnapped, that kind of thing, right? And those things can cause us not to go to a certain area. So that's what we mean by security type problems that may cause an access constraint. But I'd like to bring up another angle on this when it comes to the security type constraints. Previously, multiple people have talked about the bureaucratic access constraints, and when we hear that, we think of government bureaucracy. But I want to talk about another type of internal bureaucratic access constraint. And this is when our organization's security policies or procedures become too restrictive on our own access, become overly protective, and we're not able to actually do what we want to do. So this is the main question here, as I said at the beginning, what is the goal of security risk management? Is it to keep staff safe no matter what? Or is it something else? Is it to keep them safe within acceptable levels of risk while we achieve our goals? So, I mean, if we're not clear on this, we can create our own internal bureaucratic constraints to access. And so this is a mind shift. It's very important for managers and decision makers that what is the function of this security actions that we're taking. And finally, let me touch on one more thing, and I'll get back to you because I know time is short. There's another internal constraint that I would call a sort of internal, informal, cultural issue inside of organizations that could be an access constraint. And this is the perceptions of staff and program managers on the risks they may be facing, or even on the assumptions of where they can go or who they can talk to. So and we've seen this multiple times, that without clear dialogue between security advisors and program managers, there could be this self-imposed inhibition to go a certain place or do certain things on perceptions. So that's why we need clear dialogue early on between program managers and security advisors to have a rational and structured examinations of the security risk that people may face when doing a humanitarian action. So I'll just leave it at that. Just a different angle on what security type of access constraint may be conceived as. Back to you.
Thank you, Paul. I think that raises a very important point. Sometimes access constraints comes externally, but sometimes they also come from internal processes and our risk perceptions. But at the same time, global data shows that the bureaucratic and administrative impediments are now the leading type of access constraints. So my next question, noting that bureaucratic and administrative impediments are the leading category of access constraints, what does that tell us about options for access solutions? Are there limitations to field level engagement? I would like to first turn to Colin and then Omar. Colin.
Thank you, Li Wei. And I should say thank you for having me. Everybody else said it. I forgot. Thank you for having me.
No worries.
Honestly, I've not heard that it was the leading category. That's interesting. I would absolutely agree that it's certainly among our most persistent and difficult to resolve. I think these measures are often technical in form, but structural in effect. And what I mean by that is like a delayed visa, customs clearance held for review, registration requirements. They may come across as procedural and viewed individually, but I think what we're dealing with is a pattern recognition problem. And when that pattern is affecting multiple organizations simultaneously, it obviously shapes the operating environment in a more systemic way. I think it's important to mention that in many contexts that we operate, administrative controls sit within the broader national policy and potentially security frameworks. And obviously governments have legitimate regulatory responsibility, so I'm not questioning that. But what I think is interesting is that if if our constraints that we're seeing reflects policy level considerations, then procedural fixes alone will not be sufficient. And what I mean by that is, like, no matter how much we try and align ourselves from a compliance standpoint, we're not necessarily going to shift the broader environment. So no matter what the template looks like, no matter how often we try and get the font type right or whatever details that may be requested of us, if it's systemic, then we need to be better about recognizing that pattern, because it's going to limit our ability to engage at the field and to move the needle. I think that, again, country teams can negotiate timelines and clarify procedures, but it's important for us to recognize when it's moved beyond that. And I think that's where, in my current role, because I was the head of WFP CivMil for years, but in my current role, this is where humanitarian diplomacy starts to take effect. And this is where I see real value in that new sort of trend that a number of agencies are taking forward. And I think that along with a collective engagement through the RCHC leadership and principles level dialogue may be required for us to really untangle some of these more wicked problem sets. And I think it becomes important that we do this in a collective way, because that protects us. And it strengthens the credibility, and it reduces the exposure of specific agencies and organizations. I think the risk is not simply like slower processes. It is actually the gradual narrowing of humanitarian space through cumulative administrative measures. The regulations themselves have been somewhat weaponized against us. And we need to be better about recognizing those patterns early so that we can leverage political opportunities to push back. And in order to do that, we have to work more closely together in a more transparent way. It's not just happening to you, it's happening to all of us at the same time. And that's the trick. Back to you.
Thanks, Colin. Now over to you, Omar.
Yes. So yes, I had heard for several years and in different countries that bureaucratic impediments were one of the leading access constraints. But I always ask whether if there's an analysis bias to that answer or to that positioning, right? To what extent are we looking at the right access limitations, or to what extent are we asking the right questions to the right actors in order to mainly see administrative impediments and perhaps not see others? But certainly, even though there are bureaucratic impediments that block responses, there's also alternatives that defy successfully those bureaucratic impediments. And surely for many of you already, Darfur is coming up to the on the top of your head, no? Where, as we know, there's been a constant on and off blockade of crossing the border from Chad during the last couple of years in order to serve the Darfur population, with SAF taking a clear political stand when it comes to that border crossing and blocking many actors from delivering. However, in parallel, as you know, there were many others who were delivering, starting by MSF, but not only, right? So was that administrative bureaucratic impediment categorized as one of the main ones such that would impede the full system, or it was impeding only a part of the system? And what I'm trying to say here is, do we have to continue defying those and then simply accept that the richness of the ecosystem is that precisely we all have different levels of political involvement in the responses, and there's some actors who are perhaps more independent to defy and to actually continue delivering, even though there are those politically led administrative and bureaucratic impediments? No, I think that it's always healthy to look for these type of alternatives. Then what I have seen as well is that access, localized access, does not always respond to the same phenomenon as nationally seen access, meaning that if you would go to a province in a particular location, I don't know, to Blue Nile or South Darfur, to have Sudan still on the top of my head, perhaps that was not the most common bureaucratic impediment, and decentralized access negotiations with actors who are based on the ground and who have a different level of engagement with the local authorities, perhaps less politicized, once again, is a successful and alternative model to compensate bureaucratic impediments, right? And then, of course, the issue that has been on our mouths for a few years now, all the time, which is the famous localization of the response, of the access negotiations, etc. And then to what extent having local actors taking a little bit more of a lead on the identification of the risk or the access challenges, the identification of the right people to engage in order to solve them, and most importantly, taking the lead with the capacity of delivering the main services that are missing. Is that an alternative? Is this something we could be pushing forward? But again, that's a very common question that has been differently answered or optimistically answered in the last years, but not that optimistically or not that effectively applied, right?
Thanks so much. I think all the points made, like for us to make all those functions work together. I think colleagues also made a point. Coordination should be the key, and Colin, you have said, I think ideally the functions should be working in concert. But in most field contexts, I mean, for example, security cells and access working groups and operate in parallel, but they don't always work in concert. I would now like to turn to Savita, who is joining us from Kinshasa. Savita, what does genuine coordination between these functions actually look like, or should look like on the ground, and what are the honest tensions that get in the way? Savita, over to you.
Good morning from Kinshasa, and thanks for having me. I would like to a little bit delve in history. While I understand, as Colin was saying, that situation is getting more complex, but we can always learn a lot from history. And looking back for last 18-20 years, during my work in crisis zones such as occupied Palestinian territories, South Sudan, Afghanistan, Iraq, and currently in DRC, I have found that effective coordination between DSS, security cells, and access working groups really relies on trust, honest information sharing, and sincere collaboration. But after said that, I would like to also mention the point about recognizing the patterns. And we all in the field level should be recognizing these local patterns, and differences are always there in each location, and we have to develop tailored strategies. So one solution cannot fit all the locations. Now, this kind of examples, if I want to give, I would really like to go in certain joint projects, analysis, missions, and synergy, which we have developed over the years, especially DSS, OCHA, agency funds and programs, and all humanitarian implementing partners. I'll like to take us to the South Sudan project, where we literally developed multi-year SURF funding project, which still continues since 2012. DSS has established an exclusive office in OCHA to work with humanitarians on access and security support. And this project got further replicated and enhanced in Iraq during post-Mosul recovery, in Yemen and other locations. So this is one way of responding to have the concerted efforts together. Now, I would also like to go a little bit behind, and that is the establishment of access cell in occupied Palestinian territories in 2009-10. OCHA, DSS, UNOPS together developed this project, and I'm really glad to look at that particular project having a lot of prominence now, even in current Gaza crisis, when managing the access. So this is one of the kind of which has become a successful project over the last 15 years, I would say. Now, coming to DRC, last 6 months I came here and I'm observing the things. Things really happen here a little bit differently. There is a lot of collaboration going on, a lot of information sharing going on for safe and secure access in many difficult situations, mainly in Eastern DRC. However, because of the constraints and some tensions there, and I'm going to remark on tensions in a moment, we are not part, DSS and security cell, not exactly the part of saving in the access working group. We don't have formal saving lives together. But hey, guess what? Still everything is working fine because we have found options because we want to work together for common, shared, and collaborative goals. But this brings me back to the tensions. What are the tensions? Now, I have worked in peacekeeping missions, political mission settings, and I can see that inherently there are tensions between the mandates of the missions, perceptions of community towards mission, and work of humanitarians, and especially access and security gets in between. And even in standalone country team HCT settings, we can find these tensions between overall UNSMS mandate, which Paul just referred to, whether we are doing too much of bureaucratization of security risk management processes, and can we really find more flexible solutions to resolve these tensions? That should be also looked at, especially in only standalone country team kind of settings. In peacekeeping missions and political missions, definitely the leadership has a strong role in internally teaching and mentoring our security colleagues to work much more on understand the humanitarian concept and context so that they work differently that for mission and differently than for humanitarians. So those tensions could be again resolved if we are having, as someone mentioned, our colleague mentioned, based on leadership as well as internal DSS and agencies leaderships in security cell also. And lastly, but not least, some of you have already mentioned the tension that has been triggered with the funding cuts. Basically, we don't have luxury now to argue between access working group and security cells and DSS. We have to collaborate. We have to do more in less in very complex environment. But if we are collaborating on common goals with synergy, we can make it happen. And that's my personal field experience indicates. Thank you very much. Over to you, Leve.
Thank you, Savita. It's always good to hear some real operational examples, and I think Omar has already shared some examples from the context of Somalia, for example. Omar, do you have anything else to add as an example where these functions working well together?
Yes, certainly. So I'm going to be then now perhaps giving an example of where the international ecosystem has worked well together. When it comes to the interaction, coordination, collaboration in between, security, civil and access actors. No? And I can think very quickly about places like North Nigeria or the emblematic case study of Northwest Syria, right? Where I think there was a very successful, in my opinion, a collective effort to continuously maintain access. And these work, in my opinion, because of a certain level of efficiency in the coordination mechanisms, something that matters a lot, a collective agreement to disagree and to tolerate the different approaches. That was also a very healthy factor of the success of these systems. Perhaps a very strong local actors presence. Another key variable for a successful coordination in between these three different typology of actors to maintain access. And then, as I said, when agreeing to disagree, you end up having an organic and a liberal system that at the same time is coordinated, collaborates with each other, and that engages at the same time with security actors. No, and this is perhaps a challenging one when you have different interlocutors engaging with the same security actor or with different security actors. They very often have a tendency as well to use that, no, and then to play on the different competing priorities of humanitarian actors. So the fact that then humanitarians talk to each other and simply understand that they have a same global objective, but perhaps different tactical approaches or different short-term objectives, and that's okay as long as they talk to each other and they try to coordinate and collaborate. So yes, that exists. And that definitely can be replicated. And I think I see something similar today in Sudan, and that's certainly promising and allows us to keep optimistic. But in parallel to that, I would like to remind once again the fact that you also have actors that play a role on security, that play a role on access and on civil military engagement, who are not UN agencies or INGOs or even local NGOs, who are not labeled or known visibly as such, but who in the end, on their own local environment, are leading on security, civil and access. And this is the local model that I was sharing before that, Civic very often tries to support. And I gave Yemen and Somalia as examples. And I think this is something that, deserves visibility, deserves zooming in, deserves additional consideration for partners to simply, look at what are the structures that are in place, and then how are those self-protection or self-access negotiations happening by local communities and succeeding, and how can we empower them, right, with the technical capacity, support, or political backup. So yeah, there's examples in both dimensions, in the dimension that we all know and we all are part of, and in that dimension that we do not see, which is perhaps the largest amount of population who are in crisis, who are negotiating by themselves in order to get what they need.
Thank you, Omar. I think thank you for emphasizing the importance of dialogue and also local engagement. But at the same time, humanitarian operations often rely on technical mechanisms to facilitate access, things like humanitarian notification systems, verification systems, etc. So a final question before Q&A section. This is for you. Technical arrangements such as notification systems are sometimes presented as access solutions. Are these genuinely facilitating access, or are they sometimes formalizing new constraints under a different name? And how can we distinguish between the two? Over to you, Colin.
Thank you. The concept of technical arrangements is grounded in IHL, so it's a thing. Specifically the Geneva Conventions and Additional Protocol 1. So it recognizes that parties to a conflict may prescribe technical arrangements for the passage of humanitarian relief, provided such measures do not prevent the rapid and unimpeded delivery of assistance. The WFP IHL law focal point is in the audience, so I just want to make sure I got that right. Yeah.
Well done.
All right. I think that this includes things, as you mentioned in the question, like notification systems, but it's also armed escorts, ad hoc customs import agreements, even verification mechanisms. And I think that in principle, they're all intended to enable our operations. I think going back to the idea of notification systems, these are fundamentally designed as good faith arrangements. And I think that's where we've started to diverge. So over the last 5-10 years, where we were setting up notification systems, it wasn't always perfect, but the idea was that this was going to help us, adding additional transparency to influence the deliberate targeting process, was going to offer a level of protection that would allow us to have greater access. I think what we're seeing is that the intent is changing. And we are having to debate whether or not these are genuinely facilitating access, or are they incrementally shaping administrative control over it. I think that it's very easy for something like notification systems to shift from transparency to like explicit or implicit authorization of movement, especially if it gets conditioned on acknowledgement or even overwhelming data requirements, draconian timelines. It becomes less about allowing us to move than deciding when we can move. And I think that is an example of how these systems are sort of being manipulated against us. I think for every positive use, there's absolutely a foreseeable misuse. And if treated purely as a compliance obligation rather than a negotiated instrument, these tools can consolidate control over time and really cause us a lot of damage. I think in the absence of effective accountability, restrictive practices may persist without meaningful consequences, particularly in an increasingly transactional policy environment. I think sort of my findings of the other questions, Leeway, is that the political assessment on these things internally to the system, but also our collective visibility are essential. We need to start paying more close attention to these. And I think that we need to be clear that the existence of a mechanism is not evidence of access. It's really got to be about the operational impact. So we tend to, and you can see this even with principles level messaging, like early days of some conflicts, you'll see things pop across the Twitter sphere that's like the notification system isn't working. It's not, it's not good enough. And I feel like we've fallen into some traps already. So I think if we can share our experiences at the contextual level, but also the global level, and help identify patterns that we're seeing, we can help to come up with solutions to these systems for the next one. And so I know Niels is sitting there and he's the HNS guy, so maybe we can debate later, but be interesting to get your thoughts. But I'll leave it there, Leroy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin, and thank you to all our panelists for sharing your insights. Now we are going to transit into the Q&A session. For our online guests, please keep posting your questions in the Q&A function. And now I'm opening the floor to our guests in the room. So if you have any question, you just raise your hand and speak loud. Thanks. Any questions? Please.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on the security cell / the various agencies, HMI functions? Where is the discoordination happening? Why is there that what you were mentioning, Colin? Where is that happening? What are the core issues?
I can only really speak from a WP perspective these days because I've been out of that particular ecosystem for a little bit. But I think from a WP perspective, you're talking about scale and footprint on the ground. So WP Security is a much larger entity than Access and CivMil. Our CivMil team is very small. The Access team is slightly larger than that. I'm talking maybe 10 dedicated people globally for Access. So when you look at the security apparatus, it's hundreds of people. So when we talk about the divergent issues, we're really looking at where you require dedicated specialized functions that actually have the resourcing to meet a specific need. So for instance, in Gaza, you have a very robust architecture. So I think where you start having these problems is really places where you can't provide that level of support because the resourcing behind it isn't there. So then we end up relying on the security colleagues to carry the water for humanitarian access related work streams, CivMil related work streams, and they are not fundamentally evaluated from a performance standpoint on whether or not they have a great relationship with the local military. They're being evaluated on the protection of staff. So it doesn't mean that they're not effective, it's just not their job. So I think fundamentally with the reduction in resourcing, we're forcing colleagues that are already overwhelmed and dealing with real issues to take on more and more and more. And that is bleeding away technical knowledge, frankly, in the system. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how I see it playing out. And unfortunately, that's a trend that just sort of continues to go in a negative trajectory.
Thank you.
Just before the next question, any online participants, panelists want to come in on this issue? Okay. Look, you are the next one.
Thank you.
The ladies first.
Thank you. My name is Charlotte Magnus. I'm not a humanitarian. I'm a legal researcher. And my question would be to Savita. You talked about honest information sharing. And I was wondering, we see in Gaza that MSF is leaving or plans to leave Gaza or is made to leave Gaza because it's not sharing staff names with Israeli authorities. And I'm just wondering, is it a common practice to share names? Is that a common demand? How does it usually work in other contexts? Thank you.
Thank you. If I may, Living?
Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the question. So based on my knowledge of Gaza some years back, I can I can say that Israelis really like to get maximum numbers of details, and situation has changed, and situation has got much more explosive over the last 3-4 years. However, it really depends on how much, again, that particular entity want to share the details with COGAT or all those entities. Those are functional in Israel. And that is kind of an outlier, I would say. But coming back to my comment on honest information sharing, it was more about internal information sharing than with the external entities, because that stand has to be taken collectively by humanitarians in humanitarian country team, if possible, as far as sharing information with external state or non-state armed groups. But coming to honest sharing of information, I would really go more internally, where access and security, wherever there are overlaps, and it's not that everything overlaps, but we need to have that honest back and forth so that we can really repurpose our SRM, security risk management processes, in much more flexible manner, which is a requirement of UNSMS entities, agency funds and programs, and humanitarians in very high risk locations. So that's where my point was about honest information sharing coming up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Savita. Any points from other panelists? Okay.
Maybe just in one operational and simple sentence, I would say, as per my humanitarian experience in the field, that is not a common practice. Certainly, as Savita was saying, the Israeli authorities are perhaps an exception to the norm, or they are one of the strongest, or the strongest state actor that humanitarians have to deal with, one of the strongest or more assertive. But generally, that's clearly a red line, and that's why in MSF it's generating so much debate. MSF has, I would say, almost never or very rarely offered information about their beneficiaries or their employees, right, for the obvious reasons. So I would say no, that's not a common practice, and there's surely exceptions.
Thanks so much. You have the question?
Yes, thank you, and thanks for an interesting panel discussion. For security, civil, and access to work effectively together, you of course need effective coordination, like many of the panel members have noted, and of course the correct and right leadership skills. Are we investing in these skills to make sure that we have the right people and the right positions to make these functions effectively collaborate? Any panel member here?
In my opinion, it's underfunded, and we need to sort that out. And I think the missing piece on the panel, probably intentionally, I blame UNHCR, is OCHA, and they're also underfunded when it comes to the coordination aspect of that. So we require a strong OCHA to manage these types of work streams in collaboration with DSS and the security side of the house. But I think that it's a chronic issue across the board. So I don't think any one of these particular technical specializations is funded to the level that's necessary to meet the challenge we're facing today. And obviously, there's no solution to that that's readily available. So I think we need to figure out some creative ways that we manage that problem. So that would be my take on it. But happy for any of the security colleagues or anyone else to challenge me. Over.
Any points from other panelists? Omar, you want to?
Sorry, if I could jump in on that. I think probably another area that is perhaps underrepresented on the panel, and forgive me if I'm wrong, is that we don't have a forum leader or a forum coordinator involved in this discussion. And I think my colleague Anthony from INSO, who some of you may know, is running around Geneva at the moment, would be somewhat annoyed if I didn't raise the prospect of forums becoming less funded or underfunded, and they obviously play a critical role, particularly at moments of crisis, in terms of coordinating security access and SimCoord activities. So again, Anthony being a former coordinator from the Sudan response, again, he can tell you in person how critical it is, the role of having an assertive forum or similar body to bring together NGOs so that they can share collective perspectives on particularly access impediments and bureaucratic access impediments. and generating some of those kind of collective positions that I think several of the contributors spoke to. So ensuring, from a donor relations perspective, ensuring that forums remain, funded to a sufficient level to play that kind of role, I think is probably going to be of increasing importance moving forward. But sorry, I just wanted to add that in.
Thanks, Phil. Omar, you still want to comment?
Sorry.
Yeah, so
Johan first? Okay.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but just maybe one addition to that. I think of course it's like in the end it always comes down to like, is there money and can we do that? But I think other part of that I think is like we have become so technical in all of these different areas that we're losing the oversight of the strategic level. Why are we there to do what we're trying to do? And I think if we're looking at, we have created these silos to like define our professional areas. I'm an access expert, I'm a security expert, I'm a SIFML expert, and so forth, which is important. But I think over the last 10 years, it has grown to an extent where we have set up these different structures, and as Anita mentioned it before, right? So you have like the different coordination structures which don't necessarily talk to each other. So you've got the humanitarian access working groups, you've got the SIFML working groups, you've got the security cells, and if you go to the field and speak to them, like how many of them are actually talking to each other? How many of them are talking to the NGO forum? You'd be surprised that there isn't a whole lot of conversation going on, right? So I think while of course more resources is going to be helpful, but I think we also need to have like a bit of like a structural shift on that as well. And also while I think access and SIFML and security are probably the most related functions in our minds, but I don't think this is what we're trying to achieve as possible if we're excluding in this conversation. I know, Colin, you're sitting here with your HD head now, but like humanitarian diplomacy, advocacy, protection programs, right? So like that's what we're there for, and we need to look at a much more integrated strategic framework, right? And like we're all part of that. Who's engaging with whom at what level on what issue to address some key issues? And I feel like if we come together in a more strategic way and define the areas, define the levels of engagement, we can overcome some of the issues which we will have more and more because of like the lack of resources. So and so therefore we need to like break some of these silos, of course, but remain these distinct roles and experiences and functions while opening up slightly to ensure we're getting the most out of it, especially right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Johan.
So I was going to say something very much in line with what Joachim said. So thanks. I'm going to support that or to back up that approach, perhaps with different words. I wanted to zoom out and say that it depends from which angle do you look at it, right? Is the glass half full or half empty? But certainly we have to acknowledge that today or until a year ago, the system was as best equipped as it has ever has. No, so there's never been such an amount of knowledge, technical capacity, and investment on those elements, as Joachim said, to the extent that it may have been over technified or over professionalized in certain instances. So would additional funds contribute to a better system management, a more efficient response? Probably yes, if properly applied. But today that's not the situation in which we are. So for me, it is important that we all call ourselves and to our respective institutions to go back to the polyvalence that usually a humanitarian actor, or unfortunately a humanitarian actor needs to have. No, and then I don't think it doesn't hurt. I don't think it hurts to simply give additional trainings to the different members of an organization on security management, on engaging with military actors, and on being able to solve those type of daily issues that they are facing. No? And I'll say that I say this because of having seen it and having experienced, right? I come from over a decade of years with MSF on the ground, and I have seen myself how doctors or nurses have been the ones contributing to the security analysis, identifying a new risk, solving a security problem, or engaging with military. Ideal, maybe not, but that's what it is, right? At one point, it's part of the business. No? So I guess it's just a reminder about the fact that I think institutionally and individually we could be more polyvalent, and we could increase the appetite to say, well, you have to know about this, whether you like it or not. You're not a technician, but you need to know what it is to do a risk analysis, how to mitigate the risk, and how to talk to a military person, right?
Thanks a lot. Any points from other panelists?
If I may, Levi?
Please.
I think previous two speakers, I really want to underline and second that important message which is coming from there. We should not be creating rocket sciences here. Too many labels have been created over the years. Too much technicalities have been added, and we are forgetting in those technicalities that we are here in the field for some common objectives, and we need to work together, more so when we have less resources possible. And let's not create more and more technical features and fragmentation. I am with Joachim and Omar. We have to really make interpollination much more successful and remove these labels. And as I mentioned about DRC, we are exactly doing these things without having those labels on our forums. So just really wanted to add my voice to what is being spoken here. And I'm very glad to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you, Savita.
Liwei, I'm going to come in.
Please.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And I want to, obviously we're not answering Luke's question 100%, which is the question of leadership and coordination. But I want to take come back at a different angle here. And it's about, we talk about distinct roles, right? So we say security, CivMil, access, distinct roles. I want to come back to my intervention. Are we clear? We're clear that security has a distinct role, but are we clear what that role is? So in what I would call the old days, there was idea that security is protecting staff, program people want access, and together that sort of pressures will end up with a balance, right? And I'm challenging that the security role isn't that protecting staff. And I call and mention evaluating security on the protection of staff, and that is what we're trying to change, that mindset. That even starting at security, it is not about protecting staff only. It is about getting the right balance between the acceptable levels of risk to staff, but also achieving goals. And so security, the role of security really needs to see, before it gets into the mix, that it's already considering the results and achieving results and not just protection, if that makes any sense. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. I think I saw another hand raised. Please, the gentleman in the back, please. You two can decide the sequence.
Yeah, I salute the work that you're all doing. I want to change the focus slightly and ask a question which might sound slightly naive, but to what extent are you and who is engaging with military planners before the event to identify humanitarian security needs? And I look particularly at things like the Transitional Authority in Gaza, perhaps the peacekeeping force in Ukraine. I look at what happened in Mosul 10 years ago, where humanitarian needs were completely out of the question until it was almost too late. And so who's engaging with military planners at the sort of J9 level to anticipate the needs before it happens?
Thank you. Maybe I can add to the question.
Please.
Complimentary.
Yes. So I'm the coordinator for the shelter cluster in OPT. And we have a lot of access restrictions to do shelter programming in Gaza.
I'm sorry, you are a little bit far away from the mic. Could you tune up a little bit?
So as a shelter cluster, we have a lot of impediments to do shelter programming in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. These days, and in the presentations, I saw that there was quite a robust system in OPT when it comes to civil-military coordination. I heard that there is a good system of communication, but I think from the ground perspective, it's the complete opposite, right? We have zero access when it comes to materials. We have 35 NGOs being banned. We have UNRWA being delegitimate, basically cannot operate in Gaza anymore. We see the gasification of the West Bank. So all these systems are there, and I guess they are well designed and well functioning, but the outcomes are just not working. At the moment, we have the CMCC, which is bypassing the existing systems in a way of negotiating access. We have the Board of Peace trying to take a place, which is maybe something that OCHA is taking normally, right? So how do you see this? Because I think one of the panelists commented on this, that all these systems are also easily manipulated towards decreasing access and certain political outcomes. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
I think that panelist is you, Colin.
Yeah. Let me get to the second part of that question in a second. I think the first part, who's engaging with J9, there was within WFP, there's a couple of folks that are interacting with various J9 capabilities in response to high level emergency contexts. It is not as consistent or predictable as it was 4 or 5 years ago. So we're having to pick and choose the ones where we try and hit the command and control line higher up at a more senior headquarters, and trying to influence there rather than waiting for stuff to sort of sort itself out at the ground level. So it's hard to be more specific than that, because you can't take a team of 20 plus people, shrink it down to 3, and expect the same level of influence to happen. But we're still trying to do it at sort of a global level, to maximize what we can do with the investment that we still have. And that's not a judgment call on WFP. I mean, WFP was forced to downsize quite substantially, so we did the best we could to maintain as much capability as we could. On your question, sir, I think I was speaking around the problem. I think the issue is you can have the robust teams, you can have the technical specialists, but then you're dealing with a policy that is not aligned with the humanitarian objectives. And I think it's not necessarily new for our community, but I don't think we've ever quite seen it ramped up to that. And I think what's concerning for me is beyond just your specific context, is what other more assertive states, groups, de facto authorities might learn from this as a way to manipulate the system. And I think you can see parallels in other places. And I think that's what I've tried to pepper through my comments, is that if we are going to push back on this, it is much easier to do it at the beginning than 3 or 4 years down the line. I think at this point, it's nearly immovable. So I think we have to be better about working collaboratively to identify the patterns. We need to work together to flag those risks and specific asks up the chain through new tools like humanitarian diplomacy, leverage people like Tom Fletcher and his networks, and ensure that when we do have asks, we are adult about it, and we don't say things like, response in Sudan bad, please help. No, we need to be very explicit about the asks so that policymakers in the limited windows that they have to worry themselves about us can action a point. And unfortunately, it is a moving target. I mean, this week it's Witkoff. Who knows if he's even going to still be employed in 2 weeks? I don't know. So those pressure points are changing as well. And we need to be better about understanding how we're going to influence multidimensionally going forward. And it's not going to be WFP can do it by itself. We're really going to have to work together, because the capacity is shrunk everywhere. And one principal may have a better network with this group, and this principal may have a better influence with that group. And even then, we'll see. I'll leave it there before I get myself into trouble.
Thanks, Colin. I think, and also thank you, colleagues, for proposing the questions. We have actually unconsciously answered already the question from online, and great minds think alike. The questions is also kind of similar. So I think before the end of our session, I would like to invite the panel to share maybe a final reflection, a call to action for our participants today. What would be your kind of final reflection today? I'm going to start from our online panelists. Maybe Savita, you are the first on my screen.
Thank you very much. Really interesting panel to participate. So solution, in my view, remains dialogue. How much uncomfortable conversations those may get between security, between access teams, with the external host government, state authorities, non-state armed groups. We have to really continue with this dialogue constantly and adapting solutions to the local situations, to find the creative solutions. And as is being mentioned by many, is that we have to work in much more collaborative manner than in technically fragmented manner. And finally, we are all here together for synergistic work for humanitarian agenda. And I think if we keep our goals simple, we will be able to achieve it. And having some decentralized local approach without many labels would also be helpful in a variety of situations those we have encountering, and we may encounter many more in coming year and years. Thank you.
Thank you, Savita. Paul, do you mind coming next?
I'm just going to reiterate the same thing, right? We need a mind shift to continue the mind shift change that security is meant to enable and not just to protect, and focusing on the problem solving and not just our role in the solution. That's all I want to say.
Thanks, Paul. Jochen?
Thanks. I think like three main points from my end. I think first of all, like access considerations, and I would include security and CIFMIL in that as well. We need, in general, as a community, we need to move beyond like the technical or ad hoc approach to like access or incidents, to look at a more integrated and strategic framework overall. I think that's one piece. And I think the way this could potentially translate is if you look at the way we plan budget for the humanitarian operations, all of our planning cycles, we always have access or security or CIFMIL considerations, whatever it might be, as a side note to inform the context, but it's not integrated into our planning. And so if I know that we're operating in, and especially right now with hyper prioritization, severity 4 and 5, if I know we're operating in these areas, I need to have a plan, I need to have a budget, and I need to know what the issues are and look at like what initiatives at a strategic level potentially I need to put in place, and I need to resource that. And so at that, and resourcing could be, you know, like a better coordination at like a field level, but also like at a global level. And I think finally, and again, like I think we're all mind shifting, but so in general, we're always talking about like solutions to access, and I don't think we need, and I think there needs to be a mind shift. It's not a solution. We're operating, we need to be able to manage operating in complex environments. And if we move away from like, we have an issue, we need a solution, then that's going to be like very hard moving forward, but we need to get used to operate and manage these environments, so respond to issues while acknowledging that's not the end of it, but at the same time anticipate issues to help us in our planning processes, budgeting, and HD engagement and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you, Jochen. Phil, next is you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, probably just to touch back on what I spoke about at the beginning, that the crisis of acceptance that we currently see will require a systemic response, both across the system, but also within individual organizations. I think, as many of the participants have touched on, seeing various issues as kind of the siloed responsibilities of particular technical specialists is not going to be constructive, and indeed in an age of constricting funding is not going to be possible. So we all need to, you know, engage with the idea of identifying emerging risks, whether that be, you know, criminalization of aid, or the sort of the bad faith creation of notification systems or other forms of bureaucratic impediments, identifying those, constructing kind of systems for monitoring and engaging with those. That's going to be something that involves participation across individual organizations. It's not going to be the reserve of the access specialist or the security specialist. Again, on that prospect of the creation of bad faith mechanisms, technical processes, as I mentioned before, are not a substitute for meaningful dialogue. Like, the only way that we're going to really address the prospect of those, as I say, that kind of creeping series of impediments that may be disguised as the sharing of details or the planning of movements, is if we develop collective positions on those. And again, that involves dialogue internally as well as with the powers of a particular authority that may be implementing those systems. And finally, again, just to touch back on something I mentioned before, different organizations have different capacities with regards to security, access, and indeed SIM-Coord, and we should be reinforcing success in that regard, given as I said, the shrinking resources that we have to work with, and not assuming that everyone in the sector can enjoy the same degree of access, but recognizing which organizations are well suited and well placed within individual contexts, and then working with them to effectively empower them and maximize or capitalize on the channels and the advantages that they enjoy. So that's everything from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. And Omar, one final reflection from you.
Yes, I think there's a space to maximize the engagement with security actors. I think there's good mapping of who is who, but I think that needs to be implemented further, and reminding that security actors do have an strategic interest of minimizing civilian harm, and they're usually large, and there's always enablers and champions within those security actors. I think we need to find who are the enablers and who are willing to support the cause. We have no hard power, we have a very limited soft power. So I think in line with what Colin said, it's about using properly and realistically the limited soft power that we have, so with realistic demands. And then, of course, increasing civilian agency and having their voices and having them included in those discussions. They know better than anybody where are they missing in terms of needs, and what are the potential solutions to increase access and security to the responses. And that means maybe we should be localizing further the responses. And of course, maintaining an organic and flexible exchange of information in between all of us, as we are doing here and as we should be doing in other levels in other geographies.
I'll be quick because I know we're over time. I've said it a few times, so I have three. I think we need to be better about collectively doing our pattern recognition trend analysis to understand the threats before they take full form and solidify. I think we need to protect the political space early and make sure that we are starting to use these new capabilities like HD, like these new principles and old principles that may be coming in to leverage current geopolitical thinking and transactional stances. And I think, just to respond to my colleagues, I would never, if I understood correctly, so I may have missed it, but I would not be a proponent for more technical specialization. I don't think we need more technical teams. And I don't think that we're ever going to have a 300-person CivMil capability ever. I do think, though, that we've gone below the functional threshold. And I think that that's important for two reasons. One, the entirety of this conversation today has been reactionary. How do we deal with what happens to us on the ground? We are no longer in a position to be proactive. So without those technical specializations at a quantity high enough to engage before things even go this route, when we can impact policy, doctrine, influence that level so that we're better off in 10 years than we are now, because that's a 10-year plan, then we're just going to continue down this road where it's constantly firefighting. And if we stay in that lane, I'm really concerned that it's going to be difficult to match the requirements on us related to efficiencies, cost savings, and all of that. The answer is being better prepared and better influenced for later. And just to say, and I think that's how you engage with not just the J9, but the J35. You engage with the different parts of the military process flow both at the higher command level, but also at like the COCOM level or whatever the equivalent may be. And I think that's just our, the military version of this, but I think we need to do it with the policy level at capitals when it comes to the more soft side of things, the more foreign ministries. So I'll leave it there. I'm sorry I took too much time.
No worries, no worries. We're actually right on time. I want to say a big thank you to dear panelists for your support and also colleagues for your engagement in this meaningful conversation. We're about to end, but I also want to invite you to our other sessions under this area of competence and humanitarian security. We have also 2 sessions in room 9 and room 3 in the afternoon, starting from 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. Thank you very much for joining and wish you a nice day.
Thank you.